We'll start in a minute.
Λοιπόν, καλησπέρα. Ελπίζω να ήπιατε καφέ.
Well, good afternoon. I hope that you've had your coffee after your lunch. We are now starting the third panel discussion of the meeting, Joining Forces for Another Europe, of the Progressive Forum. For reasons of force majeure, the order of the panel will change. I'll give the floor immediately to Mr. Guillaume Balas, French EMP with the Socialists and Democrats Group of France, because he needs to leave immediately after that. Guillaume, you have the floor.
Désolé vraiment pour le changement d'ordre.
I am sorry for this change of order of speakers. I didn't want to change the order of the agenda. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Guillaume Balas. I'm member of the European Parliament. I am a member of the Socialists and Democrats group and a member in France of a new movement called Génération. Hussein is Benoît, former candidate for Socialists, and we decided to jointly form a movement. If I'm here today, I have chosen to do so in the name of the Progressive Caucus, which is a space created by many members of the European Parliament and ecologist MPs, among whom Dimitris Papadimoulis, whom you all know here in Greece, who is sitting at the front seats and whom I'd like to greet, given the opportunity, and many others, such as Pansky, that comes from Bulgaria. There are socialists in the Progressive Caucus. There are ecologists as well, like Messel Passon from the same party as the friend who is here on the panel. There are members of the European left, to which the Syriza party pertains. I am here in order to state the fact that the discussions taking place today here in Athens are discussions which we had started long ago within the framework of the Progressive Caucus, and I'd like to endorse them, by the way. Members of the left and of ecology parties have realized early enough the risk befitting Europe sooner or later. The risk, rather, lurking in Europe sooner or later. We see that today we have the prevalence of neoliberalism, that the recession that started in 2008 and going on until the present day has not changed. The European Parliament, the European Commission, the Council of Heads of Member States and Governments in Europe is dominated today, first and foremost, by neoliberal forces and has been promoting a political agenda which is always the same: less social state, deregulation, lower protection, competition among peoples on the basis of financial conditions, competition among businesses, but first and foremost, competition among workers, salaried employees that clash with salaried people of another business. That is the known social dumping. This neoliberal agenda is pushed to the limit when it comes to fiscal matters. And we are now here in Greece, and I needn't add anything else. In fact, the prevalent idea is that public expenditure needs to be curtailed. There need to be fewer taxes for the rich and more taxes for poorer people and lower income brackets. And finally, solidarity needs to be decreased as well. What is the practical repercussion? Recently, in an exceptional report of Donna Piketty, the economist who worked with a colleague, said in a report and concluded that in Europe for the past 10 years there's been a heightening of inequalities in every country, and also increase of inequalities within the same country, so among countries and within the same country. In short, the prevalent feature this past 10 years in Europe has been the heightening and expansion of inequalities, and we see that peoples have been disoriented precisely because of this deepening of inequality. They no longer have control over their lives, and they dispute and question democracy itself. Voting for one or another politician, does it change things? They wonder. And we've seen that ascertained. The crisis in Europe and the political crisis afterwards in Greece have been the perfect examples of what I mentioned before. So one of the reactions of peoples today vis-a-vis this deepening of inequality and increase of inequality is expressed through the rising of nationalism everywhere. First of all, it started in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, Poland. But we've seen it occur in Western Europe as well. The phenomenon is also observed there. Brexit, with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, following a campaign against Europe, in fact. We've seen this in my country too, says the speaker, where the National Front has been gaining ground. After the elections, we noticed that, indeed. We can also see that certain states have witnessed the rising of these powers. We've seen the electoral outcomes in Italy and Austria. We see far-right, the forces like the North League that had exceptional scores, and some other parties whose opinions are disputable in certain issues, such as the party of Five Stars in the South, have also been gaining ground. And here we have the question that we've been discussing in the Progressive Caucus. What is the responsibility of progressive powers today in Europe? We have three different groups on a European level. We have different parties on a European level. And it's highly likely that the result of the next European elections and also the outcome of the national elections will lead to a debilitated left, a weakened left. In fact, except for Greece and Portugal, how many countries are today run ungoverned, are being governed by a progressive left? If we were to observe the possible composition of the next European Parliament, we'll see that the overall number of members of the left and ecologists has been decreasing. We are a minority today. And today we discussed this with John. John, you said that the problem is the opposition between Macron and Merkel, which may be the far right and not the progressive left. So it's of paramount importance that we join in order to cope. This is the scope for the progressive caucus. Not all of us may agree. Some people may be clinging on their initial political family, and we understand that. It's understandable. However, we are convinced that if today we fail to enter into discourse and dialogue vis-à-vis the forces that we need to recruit as progressive ones, perhaps tomorrow it will be too late. And to cut a long story short, I shall conclude by saying that we need to be very cautious when faced with repeated rhetorics. It's very nice to discuss indeed, but the benefit of my European party or my national party leads me to the conclusion that it's difficult to change things. Is it perhaps that we're taking a great risk by acting? Is it that we are running the risk of losing what we've already established? The problem is that clinging on what we know and not questioning things for ourselves may lead us to lose everything in the end. And it's not very serious to have the entirety of the left disappear. What is truly dangerous is to have no one to defend the ideals of democracy, the interests of the citizens, the ideal of democracy everywhere, in all continents. Who will defend social justice, which is now being disputed and questioned blatantly for the past 10 years in Europe? Who will stand by a truly ecological agenda which does not exist today on a European level and is now rendered an imperative need? Without betraying the commitment of the Progressive Caucus, I would say that our intention is to multiply meetings like the one hosted today here in Athens, to transcend the borders. May be difficult, but the fact that we have discussions like the ones that we had in Marseille in October, November 2017 is something that indicates that we are becoming more aware of these issues. We're a small force. We are European MPs, and we are here to help you as members of the Progressive Caucus.
Λοιπόν, τώρα που το πρόβλημα του χρόνου φαίνεται ότι...
Well, now that the problem of time seems to have been tackled, and Guillaume will not feel stressed about what's to come next, I'd like to discuss this forum and the pillars for the new Europe. All of us share the same concerns regarding answers to the questions that Guillaume broached before. Starting from further ahead on the panel, I'll introduce Mrs. Louka Catseli, former minister, former banker, professor of economics and finance always. From Ireland and Sinn Fein, Eoin Broin. Mr. Menelaos Gkivalos, professor of political science at the National Capodistran University. Effie Achtsioglou, Minister of Labour. And Louis Camprubi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, says the speaker, member of the Committee for the Initiative for Catalonia. As an exception on this panel, we have many women and many men. I think I may as well give the floor to a lady. Mrs. Achtsioglou, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share with you my views in this very interesting discussion on the future of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, today's discussion, this panel, focuses on the pillars for New Europe, and it is obvious that we're talking, gazing towards the future. We're talking about the need to have a new plan for the future of Europe, and I think that each time we have a discussion on the drafting of new policies, if we want to be considered serious, we need to reflect upon what has already been done. We need to reflect upon the policies that have been adopted and that are still being implemented at the level of Europe. And what should this reflection encompass? We need to check the extent to which the policies that have been adopted have served their purpose and whether this purpose has been met. And if we give negative answers to that, then common sense indicates that we need to reschedule, we need to review our policies and do this in a spirit of self-criticism that will not end up in words. And I don't think that what I said is very smart. This elementary way of thinking does not seem to prevail over the way of thinking in the institutional instruments of the European Union. In the initial plan for the integration of Europe and the single market, ever since the Treaty of Rome, there was a diffuse view that the single market would automatically lead to social progress. And it was defined clearly that the improved conditions of work and an improved standard of living would be the natural result of the single market function that would favor harmonization, that would favor convergence, and of the pay in the European Union. The automatic improvement of the quality of life of the employees and workers would be the result not only of the most efficient distribution of labor throughout the world, where the liberalization of the trade would be, but also the rise of the social movement and the social welfare state. I think that what I have mentioned definitely has not been achieved in the European Union. The results of the policies that have been adopted and are being implemented have proven wrong this will of the European Union and the central political objectives. That is the proposal for social welfare and improvement of the quality of life of workers that would come automatically from the single market has not been achieved. Rather, the contrary is the case. The frustration is so strong that we can definitely say that this is going to be the same in the future. So not only do we have no institutional legitimization of this social pillar, but also there is no social acceptance. So this the indications of this are quite evident. I think that the plan for European integration has been afflicted. There was a no vote on the constitution of Europe. This was really an affront. However, the period that followed, back then we would say that this would be a period of intense existential problematic. But if we consider it today, it was like a walk in the park back then, as compared to what has actually taken place in Europe in the past few years. And I'm talking about the crisis from 2008 and onwards that still has its repercussions and questions the survival of the European plan and the correctness of the recipe that was followed to tackle the crisis that led to the redistribution of the revenue to the detriment of the labor class. In many such cases, the crisis was but the opportunity for the neoliberal forces to impose changes for the deregulation of labor and industrial relations. At the same time, the inability of the democratic institutions to protect efficiently citizens against the repercussions and consequences of the crisis further intensified the already existing social lack of satisfaction and the flee towards the extreme right. We could see the case of Brexit. And although this reality became even more dramatic for the peoples of Europe, at the level of declarations and statements, the European Union and the European instruments continue to talk about the social dimension of Europe. And in a way, this discourse on the social dimension of Europe became much more intense as the reality became much more dramatic for the workers. We had the declarations and statements that were given a legally binding character back in 2009 with the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union that became legally binding. We then had the Pillar for Social Rights that was signed only a few months ago in Gothenburg, and an intense rhetoric around social rights in Europe. Within the same framework, in context, in 2010, the leaders of the European Union were bound to reduce the number of people under the threat of poverty by 20 million by 2020, one of the objectives of 2020. Up till now, not only have we not reduced the number, but also we have increased them by 7 million. So there is a huge divide, a huge gap between the rhetoric on social rights and social protection and the reality. And if one tries to depict and map the problem in a few words, what the core of the problem is, what the center of this existential problem is for Europe, this is none other than the issue of the social inequalities and disparities. The most fundamental issue is the issue of the increase of social disparities and inequalities. And I don't think that there is any official, EU official, that wouldn't say that the issue of social inequality is a fundamental issue, or I don't think that there is anyone who would disagree. There is the exception of a Greek politician. But anyway, this position in principle is honest, and the intention is also honest. The inequalities play an important part. There are centrifugal trends in Europe that lead to the devaluation of the European institutions. However, let me invite you to think, how is it possible, whilst we all are in favor of the equality, how is it that we keep on producing policies and under an environment of reproduction of the social inequalities? To be more specific, how is it possible at the time where we have heterogeneous political morphemes throughout Europe that are characterized by nationalism, how is it that at the time these morphemes gain ground in Europe, we, the European institutions, continue to act as business as usual? Is there a point in us thinking to find where we were able to achieve our objectives when we had in our principles introduced the right of competitiveness, of competition, etc.? The self-regulation is a deceiving concept. The European Union is most interventional. This is a rhetoric question, of course, but these questions serve the needs of a concept that makes us think, how are we to set the issue of equality not only as a priority but as an existential need? Obviously, we wouldn't put the question today, were we in under conditions of social welfare? On the contrary, we are still under the prevalence of a specific economic model that prevailed in the European continent in the last 25 years. We're talking about the Europe of the equal because we don't have it in the Europe of disparities and inequalities. We have austerity for the many, and we have these many mistakes that we're called to rectify. So equality is not a rhetoric issue. It cannot be simply a desire when we talk about governments and institutional instruments. We cannot tolerate institutional instruments in the European Union talking about the issue of equality and tackling social inequalities using psychological terms. Is this a political objective or not? We need to provide an answer to that, and we need to reach an agreement on that. Is this a political objective or not? To reach this objective, we need to adopt specific policies and make specific decisions that will serve the interests of the social majority. To this, the EU instruments need to reply together with all the political forces to reach an agreement and see how we will move forward. We believe that this political objective needs to be made more specific. And to come to the pillars, in my view, there are three pillars on which we should place emphasis. The first one has to do with processes and procedures for decision-making. And I'm talking about democracy here. The crisis has increased the already existing democratic deficit in Europe. The de facto concession of the decision-making power, political decision-making power, to technocrats and to instruments that have no democratic legitimization whatsoever cannot be justified due to the extraordinary economic conditions. The governments cannot continue to play the observer's part. So we need to have an organization that will aim at accountability, social control, to have as broad participation of the public as possible, because there will always be a risk to question in general the European endeavor to the detriment of the people. We will have those in favor of isolationism that will increase. So the first pillar has to do with the democratic procedures. The second one has to do with institutional changes in the economy. I'm talking about establishing strict rules vis-à-vis tax evasion combating for the build wealth, to make the framework of tax havens stricter, the protection of whistleblowers who have helped us. There have been other proposals formulated at a different level, such as the existence of a European Minister of Finance who will be competent and will be able to intervene to correct imbalances and to contribute to the convergence. So the second axis has to do with institutional interventions in economy, and the third pillar has to do with social justice, protection of labor and of labor rights, not only of individual labor rights, mind you. Many liberals don't have any problem with that, but also we need to be able to protect the collective labor rights, trade unionism and trade union revendication of rights, the strengthening of the structures of social protection, the upward convergence, talking about convergence towards the top. We need to have convergence towards the best of the systems of social protection, social inclusion for the groups in the population that are at risk of exclusion and marginalization. A development plan, a growth plan for Europe that will help us achieve social justice. And I think that this is what plays the most decisive part, because we're talking about priorities that aim at improving the conditions of life, the standards for everyone. Are we starting from scratch? No. Already there have been initiatives, there have been the basic, the fundamental steps on which we can build our future steps and course. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union has to be made equal to the directives. Of course, this is just one step towards the correct direction. In fact, in practice, this tool is not enough for us to reverse and topple the predominance of economic the neoliberalism. The achievements in Göteborg are only one step towards the correct direction. Of course, these are abstract declarations. There are no commitments. They have no binding force for the states. There is also the social score that has been drafted, where we have the scoreboards. It's a step towards the correct direction, but it's not enough, because for the time being we have a simple scoreboard where we see what the situation is. There are no incentives nor any counter incentives in case one doesn't achieve certain indicators and figures. The institutional proposals that have been formulated lately, we've seen some such proposals by Macron vis-à-vis the sustainable growth in Europe. They too can be a step forward. However, only if in the first pillar such reforms are accompanied by mechanisms of public accountability. So we don't need to start from scratch, nor should we be disappointed stating that things can't change. There is space for improvement. There are many initiatives on which we can set the foundations to become more daring. However, in any case, we need to reach an agreement that we need to reorient our priorities. If our goal is to have a Europe of equals. And in any case, to conclude as I started, this period that is objectively a period of reflection for the future of Europe needs to encompass also self-criticism of those who declared that the market Calvinism may lead to the welfare of our citizens. However, societies prosper in a collective way. They cannot prosper when large parts of the population are marginalized. And I will conclude with one phrase that summarizes the need for equality and justice. Quoting a theorist of the 19th century, he said, those who produce food and clothes and houses for the whole population need to be able to have a part of the production so that they can be fed and addressed properly. This was by Carl Smith. Thank you very much.
Νομίζω σειρά έχει.
Well, I think that now we have Eoin Broin, who definitely has nothing whatsoever to do with the Calvinist environment. He has the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak today. I have to say, I always feel very welcome here in Greece. The Greek people are a little bit like the Irish, just without the rain, I suppose. But also we share other commonalities. Nothing ever starts on time, and we always talk far too much, especially the politicians. So I'm going to try and see if I can resist that urge. What I'd like to do is two things. Talk a little bit about what's happening in Ireland, because I do think some of our experience has a relevance both to what's taking place in Greece and across Europe at the moment. And then maybe make some reflections on the broader themes and respond to some of the comments that were made in the debate this morning. And I suppose where I'll start is to say that Ireland hasn't just left the memorandum. Ireland is out of the economic crisis. And when I say that, all of the indicators tell us that that's the case. The economy is growing, and not only growing, but now back at the 6 or 7%, one of the fastest growth rates in the European Union. Our deficit is now fully under control, and we're expected to reach a balanced budget fully this year. The debt has reduced dramatically, not in real terms, but as a percentage of GDP, down to somewhere around 76%. And crucially, employment has returned to pre-recession levels. Just last week, the figures were released. About 2 million people are now working, about 14,000 off its high point in 2007. And then there's also the signs of growth that aren't necessarily as healthy, but property prices are increasing, rents are increasing. In fact, it's now more expensive to rent in more parts of Ireland than it was at the height of the boom. But we're also seeing, albeit at a slower level, increased government investment in public services and economic infrastructure, the return of net migration, a very good thing. And of course, in the context of all of this, the government, who have been in power now for 7 years, are claiming a victory. The reality, however, for the vast majority of people is that none of this is having a significant impact on their lives. And when I say a majority, I mean maybe about 60% of the population, according to the figures. And the reason why that's the case is because while the crisis may be over, every single day people are still living with the impact of the crisis and the policies of austerity. And you can see this probably most clearly today in Ireland in areas of health and in areas of housing. In health, for example, 20% of the population have no health cover whatsoever, not covered by the public system, nor covered by the private system. And these aren't unemployed people, they're covered by public health insurance. These are working families. Likewise, for example, with housing, while our homeless levels didn't increase dramatically during the recession, they have increased 400% in the last number of years. In fact, last year, homelessness increased 4 times greater than the overall growth in the economy. We have a crisis at present, not only in homelessness, but for the first time in the history of the state, in child homelessness, with thousands of children sleeping in emergency accommodation. And again, you could pick any area of social policy and cite similar figures. Employment is probably another key one. And every time the government tells us that employment is rising, they're right. But so is the level of part-time, insecure, or what we call 0 hours contracts. And in fact, we still have approximately 20% of households who are completely jobless, outside of the labour market, many of whom not even counted in the unemployment figures. So while there is a recovery, it's a recovery that's leaving huge numbers of people behind, and our persistent deprivation rate last year was 26%, and our consistent poverty rate was 8%. Again, figures that jar with some of those macroeconomic statistics. Why I'm saying all of that is not to tell you about what's going on in my own country, but I suppose to share the following, which is what those two separate realities create is both a challenge and an opportunity for those of us, both in Sinn Fein and on the broader progressive left in Ireland. Those people that I'm speaking about, they're no longer looking for an anti-austerity project. They're no longer looking to argue and campaign and protest against what has been done to them. They want something positive. They want a positive, progressive message about how the left is going to create a recovery, but a recovery that's fair. That not just generate wealth and prosperity, but wealth and prosperity that's shared and shared for all of our society. And that's really the political space that Ireland is in at the moment. And in some senses, many of us feel that at this point in time, we're at a bit of a crossroads. Because if those of us in the progressive left on the ground do our job right, then that very large section of Irish society will realise there is an alternative to what has been done to them up until this point. And we can seriously be in a position to challenge not just Sinn Féin, but the broader left for a position, if not a lead position, in a government. And a government that would do things fundamentally different to what we're seeing today. Not continue with tax breaks for the wealthy, ensure that all corporations pay their fair share of tax, and start to invest seriously in universal health care, affordable housing, and good quality employment that pays proper wages. The problem is, if we don't do our job properly, if we don't seize this enormous opportunity that we have, then the fear many of us have is it will be back to business as it was before the recession, with all of the risks that that contains. The only other complicating factor, of course, is Brexit. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that particular reality, but just to emphasize that Brexit cuts across all of this, just at the point in time when the economy has potential for a fair recovery and shared prosperity, we have this real and present danger to economic and political stability. Obviously, what people across the water in England do is a matter for themselves, although having lived in England for years, if I'd had a vote in that referendum, I wouldn't have voted to leave. But for those of us in Ireland, North and South, Brexit poses real challenges in terms of trade, in terms of movement of people, in terms of communities, particularly that straddle the border across the northeast of Ireland. And also fundamentally for the peace agreements of 1998, because they're underpinned by legislation on equality and human rights, which we're already hearing the British government is looking to unravel in the context of a post-Brexit scenario. So the one thing I would urge in our conversations around an alternative Europe is that is a Europe in which the democratic wishes of the people of the north of Ireland and indeed of Scotland must be respected. By significant majorities, we voted to remain, and we would urge all people, but particularly progressives, to support that mandate. In terms of the European Union then, and really I just want to make some general observations about the debate to date. Like all of the political parties in GUE and GL, and indeed in the Progressive Caucus, we want a different kind of Europe, and we share those sentiments expressed today, one that's democratic, that's social, and crucially that's people-centred. And I have to say, there was little I would have disagreed with in Kostas Tuzinias' presentation this morning in terms of the conjecture we're in and the kinds of things we need to do to change. But I would go a little further than that. I don't just think we need a radical democratic left populism. In fact, the reason I think some of us are successful electorally in our own countries is because we're already in that space. But I think sections of the European left have to stop being embarrassed about nationalism. Not xenophobic, right-wing nationalism, but a progressive cosmopolitan nationalism. Something that doesn't put you in opposition to cooperation at an interstate level. But if we concede nationalism to the right, as has happened in so many countries, then that's a terrain that they have to themselves. And one of the reasons why in many continental, Eastern and Scandinavian European countries, why the xenophobic right is doing so well, is because the left have abandoned the space of progressive cosmopolitan nationalism, unlike in other countries. And I think that's a challenge that we need to seriously think about in the time ahead. I also think we have to move beyond rhetoric. We're very good at coming up with short programs to say what that other Europe is like. When we then ask the question, well, what does that actually mean? What's the detail? How is that going to improve the quality of people's lives? Then our answers are far less clear. And, you know, in some senses, often the scale of our ambition is far greater than the sum of our strength. And we ignore the fact that the neoliberal Europe that people have been speaking about today took over 30 years to put in place, of painstaking effort by civil servants, right-wing politicians, and the media. And if we think that we can just undermine that overnight, I think we're underestimating the challenge. And I'm not going to repeat the policy areas that were mentioned this morning, and many of them I agree with, but one of the things we don't talk enough about is when we say we want a social Europe, we want a Europe that respects workers' rights, what are we going to do about the core economic infrastructure and architecture at the very, very heart of neoliberal Europe? For example, do we want to keep the Stability and Growth Pact? And if not, with what do we replace it? Do we want to keep the fiscal rules and the constraints that they place on struggling economies? And if not, with what do we want to replace them? The Eurogroup and the Euro, and Ireland experienced this as much in Greece, what are our formal reform proposals to change the way in which the currency operates and impacts on people? The European Central Bank, do we want to end its independence? Do we want to expand its mandate? To what mandate do we want it to work? And likewise with the European Stability Mechanism, where do we want it to go and how comfortable we are with the current proposals? And crucially, one of the few EU institutions that has real valuable potential and is always constrained is the European Investment Bank itself. So how much do we want it to have to produce what kinds of investments to produce the kind of economic New Deal and Green New Deal that we spoke about? And then in terms of institutional reform, and I suppose I come from a small EU member state, and this shapes some of my comments, but I think we're all agreed we want the independence and power of initiative of the European Commission to end. And we would like it to operate more like a civil service and less like an executive. But when we talk about the European Parliament, it becomes more different. So we say we want the Parliament to be democratised. But for somebody like me, that doesn't simply mean giving it more powers, because that body today is at such a far remove from the lives and influences of ordinary citizens. If you give it more powers without tackling that other element of the democratic deficit, it poses real challenges. And then, of course, there's the Council. And the only way we can really influence the European Council, apart from making it more transparent, is by being part of it, is by winning elected office in member states so that it's not just one progressive government left isolated in that particularly difficult body, but there's a real possibility of an alliance to force some level of change. So I don't have answers to all of these questions. I have some ideas and some thoughts which we can share during the discussion, but I think we need to start focusing the debate on those types of specifics if we're going to influence real change. My concluding comments then are this. I think the other thing we need to start seriously talking about is reclaiming the state. I don't need to tell anybody in this country, or indeed anybody in Syriza, the difficulties of being in control of a state that's not allowed to exercise the kind of powers that states and democratically elected governments want to. But we need a conversation about how we can return powers and authority to democratically elected member states to deliver real change to impact on people's lives, because that's what's going to make the difference come election time. Are we making people's lives better in conjunction with them, or are we not? And I think in some senses we need to stop separating out the member state project from the EU project. The EU project isn't something that operates at another plane. It is a state-driven project. And many of the bad things that have happened in terms of the economic infrastructure and architecture I designed were put on the agenda by powerful states because it served their interests. And therefore we need to have a serious conversation, particularly if we want to ensure the defeat of the far right, about how we defeat them at the member state level. What member states and what parties of the left in the European Union have been more successful, and how can we replicate that elsewhere? And then crucially, we need to ensure that we don't just have this conversation in the run-up to a European election, or we don't leave it to those people whose field of activity is EU affairs and EU parliaments, but that it becomes an integral part of the work that all of us do. And while we're doing that, let me make an appeal for two things. The first is maximum progressive unity, not just within the radical left, but between the radical left, the progressive social democratic left, the progressive green and progressive nationalist left across Europe. And that doesn't mean we have to have a single program or necessarily all be in the same alliance. But if we're not in the same room talking and engaging, then how can we expect to form real alliances for real legislative proposals for change in the future? And finally, more importantly than that, and I can't remember who said it in the morning session, but we also need to do something very important. Stop just talking to ourselves. Stop just talking to our electoral base and talk to the majority of people. If we want to make the kinds of changes that people here passionately do, we can only start to do that if the first conversation we have is the doctor or the nurse or the teacher or the unemployed person standing at the end of the dole queue, and convince them that we have something that will improve the quality of their lives and make the lives of their families, their communities, their countries, and indeed Europe a better place for all. Thank you very much.
I think that we can keep the order if you don't disagree. So we give the floor to Ms. Louka Catseli. Hello, dear friends. It's a great pleasure for me to meet with you here today to discuss about the future of Europe and the future of progressive powers and forces in Europe. I simply wanted to stress that there is a new initiative in which I'm a president together with Paul Rasmussen on the Independent Committee on Sustainable Equality in Europe, which is an initiative of the Progressive Society, and we hope that by September we will have the findings of this committee, and we will be able to promote some of the substantial solutions on issues of equality in Europe. I will construct my presentation in 4 units. So the European political crisis, the root causes of the political crisis, the pillars and potential proposals for a modern progressive agenda, and finally the strategic steps and alliances that need to take place and to be formed. I'll start with some graphs that are quite interesting. Now, you can see the rate of citizens showing trust to national governments. There is a huge drop, both in Europe, in blue, as well as in Greece, the red line. The percentage of citizens that trust national parliaments, a great drop here as well, in particular for Greece, with a slight trend of recovery for Europe. The percentage of citizens trusting political parties, Europe and Greece, respectively. Percentage of citizens trusting the EU, from 65% it dropped to 25%, and from 45% in Europe it went to 41%, although it had dropped much lower than that a few years ago. And finally, this crisis, this political crisis, is even more intense in countries that have suffered from a program, a bailout program, and where austerity policies have been implemented. The picture changed as soon as these countries exited the program, or the mixture of policy changed. However, the phenomena are really concerning and alarming. So what are the main conclusions? Europe, and in general, the developed Western societies are going through a very profound political crisis, and we need to see eye to eye to that. So this is a crisis of trust towards the traditional prevailing political system and the parties that have come to power in the past decades, and towards the European institution. This crisis of trust has led to the delegitimization of the governments, of the political parties, of the unions, of cooperatives, while at the same time we have the rise of the power of the individual power. That is what the previous speaker mentioned, that we need to reclaim the state. So the progressive delegitimization of the public governments afflicts more and affects more the social democratic parties that are based on these. And finally, the old recipe to regain our voters. We need to become more leftist. We need to have less market and more state. But it's not very convincing, since the trust to the state has been undermined, and the trust to the democratic institutions is no longer. What are the root causes for this political crisis? I honestly believe that there is not one single explanation for the political crisis. There are many causes that are inextricably linked to each other, and each one feeds the other. So I will point out 5 important causes or developments that have led to this crisis of trust. The first one is the deterioration of the living conditions of the middle and lower layers, and the increasing insecurity due to globalization, technological changes, and due to the way government parties have managed globalization and technological changes through neoliberal and ineffective policies. Such an example would be that the actual income in the UK today is lower than the 10 years ago. Who are those who have lost from globalization. We are talking about middle economic classes. This is an excellent diagram from a very important study by Branko Milanovic on inequality globally, where in fact what we see is the following. Those who have gained from globalization in per capita revenue increase are those who are middle and lower layers of the emerging economies in China, in Brazil, in Russia, etc., who lost. Those who are from 50 to 70, 80, the middle class of industrially developed countries of Western societies. These are the those who have lost. And those who have gained a lot, the exceedingly wealthy in the Western countries. This is the last quadrant. What is the second reason, which also has to do with the first? The ever-increasing inequality in revenues and in opportunities in societies. This affects the expectations for the possibility of an upgrading of each class in the future. A third factor, the uncontrollable accumulation of power of multinational businesses, in particular in the financing sector. There is an excellent study by the Swiss Institute where amongst 37 million businesses and investors, 147 businesses hold 40% of the global wealth. Fourth, the adoption of policies of neoliberalization, deregulation by governments that are manipulated by private interests, often without sufficient offsetting policies that have further undermined the validity and power of public institutions. And finally, the transition due to digital technology and social media from the institutions of representative democracy to the democracy of opinion, which is much more skepticistic, individualistic, and of limited responsibility and limited control. So what are the conclusions? Clearly, and we need to bear this in mind, there is a clear deterioration of the balance of powers between those who hold a private power that are active at an international level and those with a political power. And this has weakened the exercise of policy of national states. Social democratic parties have accepted, due to this weakness, severe compromises, increasing unemployment, poverty, inequality, the tax axing. The increase of taxes for the middle layers have caused a significant increase of insecurity, of fear and anger, which trigger the rise of extremist powers. If we accept that this is how things are, what can be done? Which can be the pillars of a modern progressive agenda? A modern progressive agenda for Europe should be drafted, taking into consideration the causes of the crisis as well as the international reality and the great weakness by the public institutions. So if we want to reclaim and regain the power of politics as against the markets, What are the pillars of our action? The pillars of this agenda can be the following. I'm going to depict 5 pillars, 5 priorities. First of all, we have the effective regulation of international markets. Europe cannot be away from the effort to regulate international markets. The identification of skewing and distortion and the need to supervise and regulate the markets, aiming at doing away with tax havens, with doing away with oligopolies or monopolies or unfair competition processes. Europe is in a position to go after these initiatives, and already some steps have been taken, as is the banking union and others. A second pillar is the safeguarding of social and individual citizens' rights, something that the minister has already approached upon, but in specific ways, by showcasing policies that are specific and that lead to the strengthening of the rights to decent living with priority to labor, employment, housing, health, and welfare. A third pillar, the strengthening of the economic democracy, that is, of the citizens' negotiating power in the labor market, in the product and services market, as well as the capital market, through the support and strengthening of collectivities and of social partners, of the trade unions, of the cooperatives, of the associations, collectivities that need to be strengthened and changed at the same time. They need to be reformed. Fourthly, making sure that there is a sustainable development policy, having processed very specific investment priorities that will promote the competitive edges and advantages of a progressive Europe, upgrading the services provided and improving the quality of life of European citizens. And finally, making sure that there is democracy, accountability and transparency in European governance by strengthening the powers of the Euro Parliament, redistribution and allocation of competencies, supervision in the exercise of policy, rules and regulations in the operation of several institutional instruments, and something that does not exist, the establishment of an independent committee for the follow-up and monitoring and evaluation of policies. If progressive powers can reach an agreement that will pertain to these 5 pillars, that will have become more specific and enriched with specific initiatives and measures, which can be the alliances and the next step forward. I think, honestly and frankly, that only through the recomposition of progressive powers in Europe we can save the European building. Otherwise, the centrifugal powers will be such that will lead to the destruction and collapse of this European operation. And allow me to point out that the European operation is the only one, in my view, that can strengthen the presence of the progressive powers in Europe at the national level and can reverse the crisis and the liberal choices. So I would add to what the previous speaker said, that it is important for us to put together the national powers, the progressive powers at the national level. We need to link this to the influence that this will have in the interior of countries, and in Europe. This will allow us to have the institutional power that will help us become more effective in our actions. What are the prerequisites for that? First of all, we need to form alliances for a common political action, in particular in view of the European elections in 2019. We need to see what we are going to do in view of the elections. Secondly, making sure that there is a reliable political representation in the European elections. European elections in many countries, unfortunately, are seen as a field where we have people elected based only on their recognition. It is important for us to provide safeguards of efficient action. Third, identification of a progressive European agenda on the basis of these 5 pillars of values and principles. And finally, we need to regain the communicative advantage that will help us show that we can take steps towards the recovery in order for us to be able to have access to the European goods that only Europe can produce. And I would conclude with something that a magnificent politician would say. Those of us who are devoted to progress are condemned to continue to dare. Thank you very much.
Ευχαριστούμε.
Thank you very much. We'll give the floor to Louis Camprubi, who is member of the Executive Committee of the Initiative for Catalonia. It will be very interesting for us to see the counterpoint to what was said before by Eoin Broin, to check things from the other side of the Brexit pressure.
Start pointing out what, in my opinion, are the 5 biggest challenges for our political generation, let's say, for the next 20 years. I'm aware that they will not sound very promising, that they will sound more like a precautionary approach, but it's our duty to make them promising and inspiring. First one would be to tame the artificial intelligence and regulate the brain-computer interface. Second one would be to consolidate the welfare state and to limit the growth of inequalities. The third one would be to preserve enlightenment, illustration, and to fight ideologically the battle against all forms of reactionarism. The fourth one would be to stop the worsening of climate change or climate chaos. And the fifth one would be to set up a multi-level institutional framework that allows, that makes feasible political alternatives and democratic and political alternatives in practical terms. I would like to make some remark of these last 2 ones, the climate change and the multi-level institutional framework. Regarding the climate change, I think the main paradigm, the main proposal would be, as it has been mentioned, the Green New Deal and the ecological transformation. I would say that the Green New Deal is not a ready-to-use model, a finished proposal, but instead is a set of values, ideas, measures, a roadmap that may allow us to fight the climate change. For instance, there are 2 new measures that maybe you are not aware, and I think they are quite interesting, that I would like to mention. First is the carbon budget. Therefore, having in mind the limit of carbon that we have to use until we reach the limit of 2 Celsius degrees increase. And the second one, it has been proposed for many years at the European Union level, is the mobilization of resources, approximately at 1% GDP at EU level, regarding Green New Deal. And I specifically mentioned that it should be at European Union level because at member state level it's doomed to fail. The economics are so integrated that it should not be valid just at member state level, and also the sectors involved in this Green New Deal, in this change of paradigm, as you know, transport, energy, finance, are so intertwined all across Europe that it should not be feasible to make them at national level. The second issue that I would like to mention is regarding the multinational institutional framework that allow us to make political alternatives feasible and possible. So in this regard, the main idea would be to expand the democratic area at the EU level, and more formally move forward from intergovernmentalism to a communitary method. This, as the idea, it should be to promote, to equalize, to harmonize the different areas. As you may know, capital flows are a global issue, the currency is at a Eurozone level, but public policies, democratic legitimation, the welfare state and the fiscal policies are at the member state level. So trying to harmonize to overcome this adjustment would be the main paradigm. And the main objective for this 5-year period would be the reform of the Economic Monetary Union governance, to make it functional, to make it economic and social convergence, and most important of it, to make it resilient to new crises, asymmetric or symmetric shocks. This should have two pillars, in my opinion. Fiscal capacity, as it has been mentioned many times, budget, taxes, harmonization, and also democratic legitimation that may allow democratic politics. For the left, as we are represented right here, I would mention some challenges. The first one would be to disentangle neoliberalist features from what is embedded in the treaties, what is responsibility of the member states, and what is responsibility of the current political majority that rules the European institution. The second one would be not to be spectators, to get involved, as it was mentioned before, in the definition and in the concrete proposals regarding the conditionalities, regarding the pool between risk-sharing and solidarity, and the institutional design of the institutional design. The third one would be to understand the complexity and the interdependence. I think it's important for us to understand the interdependence and the complexity of the European Union, but not just trying to promote the member state institutions at EU level. EU level has some particularities that maybe will not accept just an equal adaptation of the member state institutions. And to gain legitimacy, I think it should be important, as it was mentioned, the social pillar, but also the democratic accountability and the democratic intelligibility. Nowadays, some of our citizenship does not understand, honestly, what the EU does, what the EU does not does. So understanding and make it intelligible should be a challenge for us. And the last one issue would be the battle, the ideological battle in three fronts. The first one, it's not a comfort zone battle. The first one would be to promote the need for transfer or to share sovereignty. We are aware that it is not very popular, but this is a need. The second one is regarding interdependence, making clear that we are all in this together. So individual solutions for individual member states are not anything that we can promote anymore. And the third one would be to promote a demoi. I'm not saying a demos, I'm saying a demoi because European peoples are plural and we will not have any future promoting just a unified and homogeneous cultural, linguistical, historical identity. I think that we should promote the demoi based on that we are all in this together and that we share some values. So everything that I have said is not happening in the political void, and we are experiencing a time for a major reconfiguration of the political spaces. I think we should be aware that the second political cleavage has been come and is here to stay. It's not here to substitute the left-right political cleavage, but it's here to stay and to add a new layer of complexity to politics. What I think it should be relevant is how we do frame this new cleavage and what we propose regarding this. I think it's not neutral and it's political bias how it's defined. It's not the same if we define it as neoliberalism versus protectionism or as cosmopolitanism versus sovereignty. I think we should think carefully how we define it, and also I think that we should promote our own vision of this second cleavage. And regarding this, our approach, it's my proposal, should be that we are in the pole of extending the democratic area. Finally, regarding these issues of the reconfiguration of the political space, I think that political coalitions, are now to be asymmetric depending on the issue, depending on the country, and depending on what we want to do. To rule a country, to rule the European institutions, to form majority governments, it's obvious that our default and preferred coalition should be the ones that we are defining right here, between the lefts, the plural left, the radical left, the green left, the social democratic left. But to promote the deep institutional reform that is required at the European Union level, I think it's not honest just to say that we, all the left alone, will do that. So, in my opinion, we should approach for the institutional reform to liberals and also to the non-nationalistic right-wing parties to define a common set of institutional reform proposal. And finally, I think that what we are experiencing these weeks, months, days is the reconfiguration of the, in my opinion, what is the main trend that is in the political battlefield happening right now in Europe. And is the battle or the trench between the promoters of the fiscal union with democratic legitimacy versus or against the promoters of the so-called stability union. In my opinion, this is a very dynamic situation. It changes. We should have a look at what is happening in Germany and how is moving it from in this trench. So therefore, we should put all our political efforts in trying to advance the trench of the fiscal union with democratic legitimation part. And finally, so let me conclude with two issues regarding the title of the panel. Of course, we have to have a social pillar, an economic pillar, an ecological pillar, and a democratical pillar. But below that, we have to have an equalized and harmonized framework of the different areas. Otherwise, we should not be able to put these pillars in practice. I mean, the currency area, the fiscal area, the democratic area, the public policy area, all these areas should be harmonized at best, obviously not in a homogeneous way, at EU level. And regarding 2019 and beyond, what I think, we are experiencing a big push from this forum and from others towards unity between the different families of the left, the social democratic, the green ones, and the radical ones. In my opinion, we are in a historical point that the difference that made these political spaces diverge are no longer relevant. We are facing such big challenges that those differences in the past are not anymore relevant, or at least not so relevant to maintain as in eternum these three political families apart. What I think is that the need for unity should push our efforts, and it should be at the pre-electoral level before 2019, post-electoral in the parliament, and in collaborations whenever possible beyond the parliamentary configuration. we should be creative. We should push for alignments and as much as unity as possible, having in mind that 2019 is a very big date or year, but it's not the end of history, and we will have to promote unity beyond this 2019. So my last appeal, and this is my conclusion, let's push as much as possible for unity between these three families. Thank you very much.
So now we give the floor to Mr. Menelaos Gkivalos, political science professor at the Athens Kapodistrian University. And then we have at least 20 minutes for questions and remarks.
Αγαπητές φίλες και φίλοι.
Dear friends, comrades, I'd like to refer to a pillar which is particularly critical, but which before the daily crisis and the sufferings of the Greek citizens is seen as a secondary phenomenon or as a consequence of some other phenomenon. I'm talking about the crisis of politics. We correctly deal with the economic and social problems, but what we need to see is that this third pillar of politics is yet another root cause of the crisis. And not only that, but the crisis in politics has a multiplier effect vis-à-vis the consequences of social and economic crisis. This is not a secondary aspect. It's not just an economic crisis that leads to the consequences of politics. We need to think about a triangle. On the one corner, we have society, on the other one, economy, and on the third one, we have politics. The neoliberal economy has weakened the pole of politics, and this left it unsupported, and the pole of society is being systematically destroyed. So this relationship has to be restored as a whole. So in terms of an introduction, I'd like to say that I believe that such meetings and such dialogues need to go deeper in order for us to understand what is important, aside from descriptions and trying to identify the reasoning of the phenomena, is to see the root causes. And I say this because many times we are tackling superficial issues. We think that we are handling the crisis, and we see that there has been multiplied. The crisis has increased. So what we need to do is pay attention to two levels that have become weaker. The level of politics and the level of culture and civilization. In order for neoliberalism to prevail, we didn't only have the weakening of politics, but also a whole Enlightenment model that did not take into consideration the background of the socialist revolution. So this victory of the neoliberalism has not been examined. So already since the 90s, you know that the neoliberalism was came to light with the Maastricht Treaty. This is where the genie exited the bottle. This is where the was absolute freedom given to the mechanisms of the markets, both at a political level as well as at an economic level. So the predominance of neoliberalism came systematically. What it had to do first was to get rid of its political rival, politics, the political parties, and representative democracy in order to deprive society its means of expression. How did neoliberalism achieve that? First of all, with the shifting of the conservative parties towards ultra-conservative and far-right positions. That is what started out in 1995, 1996, with the Christian Democrats parties, together with the socialists managing the crisis, led to this shift. So nowadays we say we had the far right and nationalists, etc. How are we going to tackle them? This is an historical process that has started many years ago. So in the core of the neoliberal concept, we have two cycles. One has been touched upon by Effie. One cycle includes our nature as those who are interested in their own interests. We have the people of the jungle. The second cycle has to do with the theory of moral feelings. We are obliged to cooperate with others, to have a social behavior in order to moderate and curb our egoism. So what did neoliberalism do? It took one core, the selfish man, and brought it out of proportions. And the other core, with the barriers and the restrictions, etc., was weakened. The weak should die. The refugees should drown at the sea. They shouldn't have any social security, etc. So we have a swelling of what Hobbes named of the man wolf, omnes contra omnes, a war against everyone. So this is the ideology and the political strategy of neoliberalism. As parties and the conservative parties evolved, we've reached this point after the crisis of 2008, which was the theater of revelation of the extreme versions of capitalism. So the crisis brought to light the monster. The far right is not a feat of Madame Le Pen or Pepe Grillo, etc. These are the products of this structure as it evolved historically, and it is expressed through these persons, through these people. However, the greatest victim of this whole history is social democracy. And when neoliberalism prevailed, we had a vertical cleavage. Louka mentioned it, said that the middle class have suffered the consequences because they used to be the backbone of the traditional urban liberal structure as it evolved in the end of 20th century. They weren't protected by neoliberalism. Why? Why? Because they were useless. They weren't of use anymore. Industrial capitalism no longer uses and is in need of the middle class. So this balance changed. Now they don't need the middle class anymore. They shaped a very powerful pole of conservative governance that evolved to far right and extremism and anti-systemic parties. And social democracy fell for it because it was on this gap, on this divide. They had the middle class, they had the center left, so they were somewhere in the middle. They tried to build a bridge, and they built towards the center-left direction a weak base. And they placed more emphasis on the right. They had formed governments together. You'll see that as of 2000 and onwards, we had cooperation with the Social Democrats, between the rights and the Social Democrats. Before I move on, I'd like to make an analysis. We need to get to know very well our enemies. It is not enough for us to know what neoliberalism is. We need to know what it is all about. I talked about the urban democracy and how it evolved until the last decades, up to the end of the last century. We had the memories that we had the role of technology in the modern conditions. This meant that we could use the typical tools of the Marxist theory as it was evolved in the 20th century with the advent of technology, etc. From one point onwards, these things stop to be valid because this structure has changed. We have another element, the subject of the financial structure, the financing structure, and this has manipulated the economy. It has cooperated with a large part of large businesses through which it is connected to real economy, and there is this bubble. What is this fiscal structure? This is a bubble whereby on real products, on toxic and derivatives, we have accumulated an amount of almost $800 trillion, compared to $85 billion, that is the world GDP, which means that the future of Earth is at stake. And we see bubble breaks in Spain with the housing issue, the banks in Cyprus, the Italian economy, the Greek example. So this whole bubble bursts in an uncontrolled way and may take forms that cannot be controlled. We cannot tackle it. We don't have neither the methodological nor the logical tools that will allow us to tackle it. We need to be aware of the situation. So this superstructure not only plays an economic or financial role, indicatively, as you know better than I do, this superstructure in Deutsche Bank, in this purity of the financial system and the banking system, has several derivatives that are kept under the carpet by this kind-looking lady, in order for us to know where this welfare and well-being is based. Another characteristic is that this system produces policy. It makes decisions. We have credit rating houses that give us their credit ratings, and they're able to bury you under. If we get a rating from 3A to something lower than that, well, wasn't this the case with France, where there was a loss? So there is direct consequence in politics. It is able to topple governments and intervene directly, immediately. This structure undertakes the role of the political organization, the political institution, thus playing a decisive part in the developments. However, a field that we haven't grasped yet is the cultural penetration of neoliberalism, of the neoliberal model. The neoliberal model has its own language. It produces its own meanings, individualism, decollectivization, and things like that. Such terms and such concepts that are seen as technocratic, mathematic, and neutral terms, these are deeply, profoundly political terms that produce a culture, an horizon that is used by the model in order for it to penetrate the way we think. We need to think in a neoliberal way if we are to adapt in this world. We cannot say whatever we want. If we are to communicate and find our way through the system, we need to use its own language. In particular, we have learned the language of the memorandum by heart. If you listen to the terms we use, we have a special vocabulary. There is a dictionary, a whole dictionary for the memorandum. I said earlier that a large part of the political power is undertaken by the economic system. It's not simply that we have no longer traditional parties in power. Who undertakes power? This is a class of technocrats. They have appointed technocrats everywhere. These bureaucrats of Brussels should go away because they strangle Europe. But this is the neoliberal governance. These are the political managers. We're not talking about people in ties who are mean and want to torture us. This is the political representation of neoliberalism. So our conflict is in various aspects with this model. It's multifaceted. It's not only about adopting certain measures for some sectors. We have to have a overall fight. We need to understand that neoliberalism is not a particularity of history, but it prevailed as a whole array of ideas and imposition of powers. Well, I won't be able to keep my presentation within the time allotted, I'm afraid. Okay, you can have 40 seconds. 40 seconds left. So, far right, populism and production. We're talking about Italy nowadays. We are greatly concerned. If we take a look at the map, Italy has been divided into two regions in accordance with a class, the south and the north. I will be very succinct because I'm being supervised right now. So we have the class vote that is produced, and it's skewed when it goes on the top. It's as if we have a pot where we have placed the cap, and we have drilled holes. The demands are real in society. The demands are: we want to live, we want to find a job, we want to avoid over-taxation, we want to feel safe, and we want a future. So what about these demands? These demands are not politically represented. The political life has been eroded by this network of neoliberal ideas. So what do people do? They opt for an anti-systemic party. Why is that? Why? Because fear, as Chomsky says in a very recent paper, because people want to find a job and they get to be thrown at the street. So we have insecurity, fear, no perspective whatsoever. And not only do they want to get rid of the political system, but they also ignore reality, or rather they are indifferent to reality. They cannot face it. This is the distortion that exists in the expression of the public's power, of the people's power. It's trapped. The people are trapped. So if we are to do something, I will violate the extension that you give me. So we need to intervene on that level. That is, there is no mediation for the people's opinion. How are we to achieve successfully in our effort? If we want to have success, we need to have a plan that will connect the immediate proposals with the long-term measures, the long-term proposals, with our visions, our principles, etc. We cannot have ad hoc proposals, neither ad hoc nor abstract proposals that won't have anything to do with the reality. This is where we need to intervene. Secondly, in order for us to become actively involved at a European level, we need to have an authentic relationship with society. Otherwise, there's no point in us discussing on our own in between ourselves. These programs, these proposals, these theories need to go down to the grassroots, need to reach society. And society needs to understand that we are there, and we are there for the political perspective. It's not a simple wish list. So we need to have very well coordinated political action. And last but not least, the centers of power. We need to see what we will do with the centers of power. In Malta, tonight, when we had the summit, Sunday night, when we had the summit for the anniversary of the EU, we went for sleep, and we then heard in the morning that we had a multiple speeds Europe. So you can understand what this is the case. In the morning, we will find that the ESM will have become the European Monetary Fund and will have abolished the Commission, because this is what Mr. Schäuble wants. He wants to have ESM become a political instrument. So there are very topical problems vis-à-vis the policy in the EU. This can't be just an issue to be discussed between France and Germany, between Ms. Merkel and Mr. Macron, who has already been weakened. So that was a very good concluding remark, says the chairperson. Permesso, in accordance with the Italians, allow me. I will conclude. We cannot live with austerity in economy, in society, and in thought. All these walls that have been gathered around us while we were pretending that we didn't get wind of that, all these walls need to be turned down. We need to break the walls through the political thinking with care and love for those who are in suffering today. Thank you.
Well, no longer 20 minutes, 10 minutes for Q&A. Hands, if there are questions or if there are some very brief comments, there are 10 minutes overall. Nobody, says the moderator. Is there anyone among the panelists who'd like to say something vis-à-vis something that was said before, or do you all want to go out for coffee? Well, it's clear. Everybody needs coffee. Bye.